prophet and a politician fighting corruption. Imagine a man standing alone, crying out for justice in a society dominated by corruption. A prophet who faced the contempt and scorn of the elites while warning of the imminent destruction of his nation if there was no profound moral renewal. This is Jeremiah, the prophet of the Old Testament, a figure who, even in the face of persecution and criticism, dedicated his life to confronting what he saw as the decadence and corruption of his people. Now, let's jump forward thousands of years. In the 21st century, we come across a figure who, in his political and social context, also presents himself as a voice of resistance to a system that he considers bankrupt and unjust: Donald Trump. Throughout his campaigns and term in office, Trump has built a public image of opposition to the establishment and to corruption that, in his view, undermines traditional American values and benefits only the elites. Do these two characters, the prophet and the politician, separated by millennia, share the same essence? In this video, we will take a deep look at the parallels between Jeremiah and Trump, comparing how both position themselves as agents of change and how their messages of resistance and renewal resonate with each other, despite their historical differences. Stay with us until the end and discover the lessons that these figures, one religious and the other political, can bring to our days. Jeremiah, a prophet against corruption. To understand Jeremiah, we need to go back to the setting of ancient Jerusalem, where he lived about 600 years before Christ, in a period of moral and political crisis. The leaders of the time were committed to alliances and practices that, according to the prophet, completely distorted the values of justice and faith that should guide the nation. Jerusalem, under the influence of external political forces, faced a dilemma: to follow its own spiritual identity or to surrender to pagan practices and foreign alliances. Jeremiah's mission was not easy. He was called to proclaim a message that was both a warning and an opportunity. In his speeches, he openly denounced the corruption of the priests, kings, and powerful, warning that without profound transformation, Israel's future would be destroyed. He even said that the holy city itself would be razed to the ground as a result of its moral decay. However, Jeremiah was not only a voice of condemnation, he also offered hope. He believed that if the people would turn to integrity and abandon corrupt practices, there would be a chance for restoration. Jeremiah paid a high price for this mission. He was persecuted, imprisoned, and constantly ridiculed by leaders who saw him as a threat. Yet he continued his struggle, confronting what seemed to be an unbreakable system of corruption and injustice. His story is one of someone who faced loneliness and resistance, but who remained true to his vision of a better, more just society. Donald Trump and the promise of renewal. To understand Donald Trump's promise of renewal, we need to explore in depth how his rhetoric, political actions, and public image have shaped a movement that opposes a system that many Americans consider broken. Trump has positioned himself from the beginning as an outsider, someone from outside the mainstream of politics, with a successful track record in the business world. This stance has helped build his narrative of opposition to the establishment, a term that refers to the set of elites and institutions that, in the view of Trump and many of his supporters, perpetuate a political and economic system that neglects the needs of the American people. The promise of "Make America Great Again," an appeal to the past. The slogan, "Make America Great Again," has become a powerful symbol of his campaign and his political movement. It implies a promise of a return to the values and spirit of an era considered golden by Trump supporters. This promise does not necessarily refer to a specific era, but to an ideal of economic prosperity, military strength, and international respect, values that, according to him, were threatened by liberal policies and globalization. This appeal to the past creates a strong emotional identification with a group of Americans who feel left behind by the cultural, social, and economic changes of the last decades. They perceive globalization and mass immigration as threats to their identity and economic stability, and believe that traditional politicians have failed to protect the interests of the American middle class and workers. Trump against the establishment. The rhetoric of confrontation. One of the central aspects of Trump's promise was the fight against the establishment, that is, the political, media, and economic elites. Economic policies that he claims represent his own interests rather than the interests of the people. Since his first presidential campaign, he has built his image as an alternative to the traditional politician, someone who is supposedly not beholden to Washington's influences and who can therefore act more freely to bring about real change. The phrase "drain the swamp," used by Trump, has become another motto that reinforces his promise to eliminate corruption and privileges of the political elites. This metaphor suggests that the federal government, particularly in Washington, D.C., is infested with politicians and lobbyists who abuse their positions for their own benefit, without serving the interests of ordinary citizens. For many, this promise to drain the swamp translated into a desire to see powerful figures held accountable and removed from power, especially those associated with the establishment and the status quo, communication strategy, and connection with the public. The direct, often aggressive, way in which Trump communicated his ideas was fundamental to building his image as a leader of confrontation and change. He used a style of speech that avoided political correctness, appealing to the frustration of Americans who felt that their voices and concerns were not being heard by career politicians. At rallies and on social media, Trump addressed issues such as immigration, economic and national security, job losses, and terrorism, topics that were central concerns for his electorate. This unconventional communication was also part of his promise of renewal. Trump not only promised to transform political structures, but also proposed a new type of dialogue between the government and the people. He frequently criticized the traditional media, which, according to him, manipulated information to favor the elites. Calling media outlets fake news, he sought to delegitimize the criticism he received and mobilize his electorate around the idea of fighting against a manipulated narrative. The populist character and polarization. Trump's promise of renewal carries with it a strong dose of populism, characterized by a narrative of us versus them. In this case, us represents ordinary Americans who, in his view, have been betrayed by the elites that make up the establishment. Them are career politicians, the mainstream media, and global business people who, for many Trump voters, prioritize their own agendas at the expense of the population. This populist character also contributes to the polarization of American politics, since Trump's rhetoric often pits those who support his ideas against those who, according to him, represent the opposite of American values. This division helps solidify the loyalty of his supporters, but at the same time intensifies the resistance of his opponents, creating an extremely polarized political atmosphere and making dialogue between the different ideological currents in the country difficult. Criticism and controversy. The limits of the promise of renewal. Although Trump's promise of renewal has mobilized millions of voters, it has also generated controversy and criticism. Many accuse him of fueling social divisions, spreading misinformation, and promoting policies that serve the interests of specific groups more than the general welfare. Critics also point out that, despite his rhetoric of change, he has failed to effectively drain the swamp, as his administration has also had figures involved in scandals and controversies. Trump's America First approach, which prioritized U.S. interests over international alliances, has also been seen as a step back from the values of cooperation and diplomacy that characterize the country. His critics argue that this isolationism has weakened the United States' global role and created tensions with allied nations. The idea of a restored America, the unfinished mission. Despite the controversies, Trump has consolidated a loyal base that believes in his vision of a renewed America, free from the influences that, according to them, threaten its integrity. For these supporters, the fight against the establishment and the promise to drain the swamp are not over, and many see in Trump or other politicians inspired by him the possibility of continuing this mission. This promise of a restored America evokes a deep desire for belonging and security, characteristics associated with a strong and independent nation. Many of his supporters feel that conventional politics does not meet these needs, and that Trump represents the defense of traditional values and the true American spirit. The persistence of the promise of renewal. Trump's promise of renewal, with its appeal to national identity, its critique of elites, and its commitment to fighting corruption, represents a powerful facet of contemporary American politics. Orania. Regardless of the controversies, Trump has created a movement that goes beyond the political field and establishes itself as a cultural and social phenomenon. The renewal that Trump proposes is not just a change in policies or representatives, but a transformation in the way the government relates to the people and in the way the American identity is understood. His figure continues to polarize, but his impact reveals a latent desire in American society, the longing for a leadership that is committed to the interests of its citizens and that reinforces the values on which they believe the country was founded. Underscore. The analogies between the prophet and the politician. Now, you may be wondering, how can there be a connection between Jeremiah and Trump? First of all, both represent a fight against the status quo and a resistance to corruption. Jeremiah faced the corrupt leaders of his time, risking his safety to spread his message of spiritual renewal. Trump, on the other hand, used the discourse of political renewal, promising to return power to the people and combat the influence of the elites. Second, their approaches are marked by polarization. Jeremiah, for his harsh tone and warnings, was ridiculed and even persecuted. His message was not popular because it called for radical transformation and a break with what was comfortable for many. Similarly, Trump was seen as a divisive figure, criticized for his blunt rhetoric and criticism of traditional American institutions. Both attracted support and resistance in equal measure, and this polarization also reveals the strength of their messages. Another important point is that both Jeremiah and Trump represent, in a way, the figure of the outsider. Jeremiah, as a prophet who confronted the religious and political establishment, stood on the outside, observing the failures of leadership from a position of resistance. Trump, as a businessman who entered politics, also built his image as an outsider, promising to be an agent of change. Reflections on renewal and the power of resistance. This comparison leads us to reflect on the timeless quest for renewal, a need that arises especially in times of crisis and decay. Jeremiah called for moral and spiritual restoration, believing that only a nation of integrity and faithfulness to divine principles could prosper. His mission was to reconnect the people to fundamental values, even when this required painful ruptures. Trump, on the other hand, spoke of political and national renewal, promising to restore what he saw as the true American spirit. He encouraged breaking with political practices that, according to him, betrayed the trust of the people and promised a stronger and more independent America. Both men teach us lessons about what it means to confront an established system and try to transform it. The desire for renewal is something that transcends eras and figures and always manifests itself in times of great change or crisis. These voices of change, challenging the status quo, show how the struggle for a more just and integral society never ceases, but simply takes different forms depending on the context. Lessons from Jeremiah and Trump for today. The stories of Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, and Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, may seem distant, almost disconnected by the vastness of time and space. However, when we examine the figures of both, we realize that there are powerful lessons to be drawn from their journeys of resistance and transformation. Both, at different times, faced systems that they considered broken and corrupt. The difficulties and obstacles they faced, the battles against the elites and the search for something greater, more just and more faithful to the principles they defended, offer valuable lessons for today. Confronting corrupt systems. The persistence of Jeremiah and Trump. Jeremiah's confrontation with the religious and political corruption of his time is a classic example of resistance. As a prophet who defied the powerful, Jeremiah took a stand against the corrupt alliances and immoral practices that dominated Jerusalem's society. He not only spoke out against the oppression of the poor and vulnerable, but also denounced the failures of the country's spiritual and political leadership. His message was clear. The people of Israel needed to return to their faithfulness to God and embrace righteous living if they were to avoid the imminent destruction that was approaching. Despite being persecuted, despised, and humiliated, Jeremiah persisted, knowing that his mission was vital to the renewal of his nation. In the same way, Donald Trump positioned himself as someone who fought against a political and economic system that he considered corrupt. In his view, the government of the United States was under the control of political and business elites who had become detached from the needs of ordinary people. Trump made promises of renewal, of draining the swamp in Washington, directly attacking the corruption he saw in government institutions. Like Jeremiah, Trump attracted both a fervent following and fierce resistance, especially from a segment of the political establishment and the media who saw him as a threat. Both men were polarizing figures in their time, calling for radical change and challenging established norms. Jeremiah's persistence in his mission, even in the face of hostility, is echoed in Trump, who has also persisted in his promises to transform American politics, despite criticism and challenges. The fight against injustice and the corruptibility of elites, Jeremiah and Trump share a vision of fighting against systemic injustices that weaken social cohesion and erode the fundamental principles of a society. Jeremiah believed that the unfaithfulness of his people, represented by the corruption of the leadership, was leading Israel to ruin. His confrontations with the kings and religious leaders of his time were aimed precisely at highlighting the social injustice and moral corruption that permeated all levels of society. He knew that in order for the people of Israel to be restored, a profound movement of repentance and renewal was necessary, which would begin with the removal of the corrupt figures who were in power. Trump, on the other hand, presents himself as someone who denounces political corruption and the abuse of power by the elites. His speech around draining the swamp was a direct criticism of the vested interests that, according to him, compromise the effectiveness of government and distort public policies for their own benefit. His idea of restoring a great America again was based on the belief that the country could be rebuilt only by removing the corruptions rooted in the system and returning power to the people. This vision of Trump resonates with millions of Americans who feel that they have been betrayed by political elites who have lost touch with the realities of everyday life. Social and political polarization, supporters and opponents. The reaction to both Jeremiah and Trump was marked by deep polarization. Both were attacked and rejected by those who defended the status quo. Jeremiah was constantly persecuted and mistreated, not only by political leaders but also by priests and other religious representatives, who saw his words as a direct challenge to the established order. His persistence in denouncing corruption and moral decay made him a target of hostility, and many of his contemporaries rejected him, preferring promises of peace and prosperity that did not align with his hard truths. Trump, in turn, also provoked intense polarization in American politics. His direct and aggressive approach attracted a fervent base of supporters, who saw him as a hero who was finally telling the truth that many felt unable to express. On the other hand, many saw him as a threat to democratic values, the integrity of institutions, and social cohesion. Trump's defiance of established political principles and his provocative rhetoric have created a tense political environment, where the pro- and anti-Trump camps have seemed increasingly distant and irreconcilable. The contrast between Jeremiah and Trump at this point reveals a universal pattern. Leaders who challenge the established system often face strong opposition because their messages of renewal and change are not easily accepted by all. For many, change is an unavoidable risk. For others, change is essential for a better future, and this dichotomy creates deep divisions. The promise of renewal, spiritual and political. Jeremiah's message was not limited to denouncing sin and corruption. He also offered a vision of spiritual renewal and a restored future, but this future would only be possible through repentance and obedience. He believed that by turning to God and righteousness, the people of Israel could be restored and blessed, avoiding the coming destruction. In many of his prophecies, Jeremiah pointed to a future in which the nation would be purified and peace and prosperity would be restored. In a similar way, Trump promised a political and social renewal for the United States. His vision of a restored America was not a literal return to the past, but a recovery of what he saw as the fundamental values that built the nation: hard work, economic freedom, limited government, and a commitment to tradition. He promised a purification of government institutions, which would be cleansed of corruption and refocused on serving the interests of the common people. Both in A.S. different. They shared a vision of a renewed nation, more faithful to its essential values, whether spiritual or political. And this renewal, for both, would require courage, sacrifice, and a break with established structures, no matter how unpopular their ideas were. The vision of the future, the lasting impact of Jeremiah and Trump's struggles. Jeremiah's legacy is marked by the spiritual and moral depth of his message, which, although rejected by many in his time, was later recognized as essential to understanding the relationship between God and the people of Israel. His fight for renewal and justice is a model for all leaders who dare to speak the truth in times of crisis. Trump's impact is more recent, and his legacy continues to be debated. His movement, however, brought to light a deep desire for renewal among Americans who feel excluded or disillusioned with the current political system. He challenged established political and cultural norms, and, even in the midst of polarization, he managed to give voice to a large portion of the population that yearned for change. What we can learn from Jeremiah and Trump. The lessons of Jeremiah and Trump teach us about resilience in the face of opposition, the courage to confront the status quo, and the search for renewal, whether spiritual or political. Although their methods and contexts are very different, both represent figures of transformation and renewal, willing to challenge corrupt systems and offer a vision for the future. They show us that the fight for justice and the restoration of fundamental principles is never easy, but that it is possible to build something new, even if it involves rejection and conflict. These lessons can be applied to today, when many feel frustrated with systems that no longer seem to serve their interests and values. Jeremiah's story and Trump's trajectory offer examples of how leaders who oppose the status quo can both inspire and polarize, but above all, can leave a lasting mark on society. If you are interested in this reflection on the parallels between Jeremiah and Trump, on how historical and political figures challenge systems and seek renewal, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We will continue to explore these connections between history, politics, and spirituality in profound and revealing ways. Stay tuned for more content that helps you understand the forces that shape our societies and how we can learn from the past to transform the future.